Are you or your clients looking for a regular income solution with compelling returns to diversify your portfolio? If so, Neighborhood Holdings may be a great option for you. Listeners of this podcast will appreciate that public markets can be turbulent and finding a good private credit fund can be tough. But Neighborhood's track record, transparency, and investor alignment sets it apart from the pack. With nearly 10 years of consistent performance and a target net yield of 8 to 10%, Neighborhood has a track record of providing monthly income to investors without the volatility of public markets. How do they do this? Where banks invest in mortgages up to 95% loan to value, they also make borrowers jump through a lot of hoops. Many borrowers in transition aren't able to meet those hoops. Neighborhood has partnered with banks and brokers to provide quality borrowers with temporary financing secured by first mortgages at an average loan to value of less than 60%. Where other mortgage funds might take more risk by lending against construction, bare land, or jumbo loans, Neighborhood is focused on your average residential borrower who owns the average house in the neighborhood. Plus, their variable rate with a floor mortgage pricing benefits investors when interest rates go up and mitigates downside risk. Check out the link in the description or visit neighborhoodholdings.com to view the offering memorandum or speak to your financial advisor for more information. That's neighborhoodholdings.com/Loonie Hour. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that this information discussed today is not intended to be or construed as investment advice. Please consult a professional advisor before putting a loonie in any of these financial markets.
The dirty secret is that no one's ever going to get paid back.
People have the shortest memories when it comes to investment.
We just got to get Keith into Bitcoin. Hey, there's a bubble.
Welcome back to the Loonie Hour, episode 184. As always, joined by the three amigos. We've got the Boomer over in Ice Cap World and Rich Diaz. Montreal, go Habs, baby. We're in.
Yeah. I received many emails. We'll get to the substantive, the good ones anyways.
You're worse
I was
than
told
I
not
am.
to talk about the Montreal Canadiens for fear of jinxing them. And now that they're in the playoffs, I will respect the wishes of our Loonie Hour faithful.
Habs in 4. It's my prediction.
Oh boy.
Going to the Cup, baby. You planning the parade, Rich?
No, I'm not talking about it anymore.
You already got the parade route
Nope.
penciled.
We're just happy to be there. Just gonna try our best.
Come
Keith,
on,
how
Rich,
about the
there's
Mooseheads? How about the Mooseheads? Is playoffs started yet or what?
Soon. They're working
yeah.
hard. They're working real hard. But there's no jinx or superstitions in sports. What are you thinking about?
I completely
I'm
disagree.
so excited. I know it's a fun time of year, so it all kicks off. So we can finally.
You know what's exciting? Actually, Toronto, Ottawa.
Oh, that's gonna be amazing.
Battle of Ontario. It's been like 18 years or something like that.
Yeah, it's been a while. It's gonna be great. I don't know.
That'll be good. That'll be good. That'll be a lot of good series.
Yeah. Colorado versus Dallas. Should be
that should be a Western final. Again, we won't get into the semantics around the NHL's playoff format. I think it's absolutely ridiculous, but
I agree.
That one should be fun. That one will go. I think that one goes 7. There's my prediction.
Yeah, good prediction.
Okay, so I just have one thing to say, Rich. All this stuff. First of all, 2 things. One, last week's episode, I wanted to thank you. I don't think I was prepared for the way that conversation went last week. I thought it was going to be a bit more enjoyable. I thought it may not have been. But you were amazing, my friend. And a lot of people were very thankful to you for just how you responded to questions and everything. And as like number 3 in the Loonie Hour ranks here, I wanted to thank you as well. It was really enjoyable to hear your conversations from last week. So that's good. The other comment is, yes, my friend, you are a conspiracy theorist now. So you're now over in my camp.
Oh boy.
I think what's the French guy's name for Bloc Québécois?
Yves Blanchette.
Yeah. So he was talking about in the debates last night about the Century Initiative guy, whatever his name is. So another conspiracy theorist,
Mark Wiseman.
Yes. Anyways, but Rich. I mean, that was to date the most comments and feedback we've had on a single podcast. A second to Brent Johnson, who is also a controversial figure. So I
just want to say thank you to everybody who wrote in. I mean, we were inundated by emails. Normally I respond to everybody individually, but I basically just capitulated and like wrote a mass reply back to say thank you very much. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say about that. I don't know what else to say. I was a little bit shy and a little overwhelmed by all the comments. So, but and then normally I never, ever read the comments, but my mom insisted on it.
Mama Diaz
insisted that I read the comments, and so did Keith. And so thank you very much to everybody. Yeah, we'll keep trying doing what we're doing, I suppose.
We got lots to go on today. We'll get to that in a sec. We do have a special guest coming on today. As mentioned in previous weeks, we have the Green Chicken, Doomberg, who writes the brilliant energy Substack. I think, incredibly widely followed amongst whole host of very important and smart people. So a lot of respect and looking forward to having that conversation on, because as we've heard from all of our political leaders here in Canada with this upcoming federal election, is all about, how do we make Canada an energy superpower? Despite shooting ourselves in the foot for the last 10 years, there seems to be, everyone keeps talking now about, okay, let's get serious about ramping this up. And no better person to speak to, in my opinion, than really the expert on the subject, which is Doomberg. So looking forward to having him on very, very shortly here. But before we do, quite a bit of market talk. Keith, Rich, we had Canada's CPI inflation, which came out. And then we had the following day, the Bank of Canada. And today we had the ECB. So a lot of news in central banks. And we had actually Powell out as well. So lots going on. But Rich, the Canada's CPI inflation leading into the meeting, we had a softer than expected CPI inflation.
That's right. Should I go over it? Just a couple of numbers?
Yeah, I don't maybe walk us through like the high level notes here.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so it fell. It was less than expected. Remember, in the two camps between who's right and who's Steve, I'm in the camp that inflation's going to rise. So when I saw the number this week, I was like, oh crap, maybe I'm wrong. But one data point does not make a trend, and so it came out as 2.3% for headline, and 2.6 was expected. The core inflation ones that we look at a lot, which is the median, trimmed, and the factor model, and I have no idea what the factor model is, and those came in less than expected. But in general, we still got a bunch of the month-on-month components were still positive. So alcohol, food and beverage, clothing, footwear, that's all still sort of the unwind of the GTS tax holiday. Big drop in energy prices. Now everybody can take a big wonder why that happened. Well, it was obviously the carbon tax cut, clearly. But in general, yeah. So in general, those the monthly components that we were looking at. Shelter is still at the top of the table. We talked about that a lot, but that's continuing to come off. So that trend hasn't changed. What else do we really like to look at and talk about? We like to look at the all items X mortgage interest costs. Sorry, that's a mouthful. So that's at 2%, well within target. And yeah, I still my overarching view is that I think we still can't really extrapolate too much information or too much from the last couple of months of data, because we had the GST holiday, we have the carbon tax, and that's screwing with the trends, etc. So I think starting now or maybe even next month, we'll start to really get a feel for what's going on with prices.
Well, yeah, so most of the softness in CPI was related to energy prices, correct?
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, to your point though, I know you're like, oh, you and I argue about, inflation, is it coming back? I think it's all about like time horizons. I still think like I think in the very near term, as this kind of housing bust plays out, that it's very, in my opinion, very deflationary. But I still think you have a lot of inflationary forces that are structural, which is, government spending. I think central banks are going to have to come back into the fold in the near future. And, obviously the sort of deglobalization theme. So I think that, structurally, I still think structurally we're probably going to experience higher inflation over time. But I think in my view is in the near term, I think the housing bust is really going to drag things down.
Of course, there's a little bit of irony here. And Rich didn't use this word, but Rich, the way you described you basically said there's been a softness with the inflation data. But But all I heard when you're saying it is that, hey, this is transitory. We're going to bypass this and go back to rising
Oh my,
inflation again.
you're
That is
right.
an ironic word. It's an
Yes,
ironic.
I should be lashed. I should not be allowed to use any reference to the word transitory.
And I notice you're moving around in your chair right
I'm
now.
squirming now. I'm
Yeah,
squirming.
now you're the
I'm
squirmer.
the
You're the
squirmer.
squirmer.
I'm the squirmer. You're right, Keith. I did say it was transitory, which is, of course, yeah, should be banned from the show.
But with everyone, but back to a more serious observation with this. I mean, and obviously, you know, we have the tariff war, trade war, whatever we're going to call it these days. That has really, market reactions have overwhelmed any economic data point coming out over the last month or two. And I think as you know, as the world gets more used to or desensitized by seeing like the daily announcements and non-announcements, then we'll get back to seeing where we're really headed from an economic data. And I'm still leaning towards what Rich has come up with as well, in that I think inflation is going to be sticky here, and it's more from for other reasons than what the Bank of Canada
Well,
is
so just to
coming out
chime
with.
in there, so if you're listening to this podcast, because I get this question all the time, oh, what should I do? If you're listening to this podcast and you agree with, Rich, Keith, and again, I tend to agree with that on sort of a more, let's say, medium term. But for those that keep asking, oh, mortgage rates, should I fix it? Should I just wait? I mean, again, there's a decent argument to be made here. If that's your view, then taking something with a fixed rate and having that certainty might not be a bad idea. But anyways.
I think, though, if you're a boomer and you've benefited from generations of wind in your back, just buy the house with cash, guys. Like, don't
Yeah,
fret
can't
about
everybody
it.
just do that, Keith?
So, by the way, there should be a little bit of irritation with last week's conversation, because in the midst of all of it, we forgot to do our Twinkie bet.
Oh,
So,
right. Oh, yeah.
yeah. So, there's still feedback coming from that interview we had.
Good. Yeah. Good. I mean, it's a good segue. Obviously, the Bank of Canada was up after the CPI release the following day. Market odds kind of heading into it, Keith, were about 50-50 from what I can recall. So Tiff Macklem the squirmer there opted to hold rates firm. I think seven consecutive cuts he had. So anyways, this is his first kind of pause after 7 consecutive cuts. Rich, Keith, I'm sure I watched most of the presser. To me, the takeaway was we're going to wait and see how this trade war plays out. There's no need to sort of. I think they are struggling to say, normally a central banker might give forward guidance, but how do you give forward guidance in a very uncertain environment where every day the White House is coming up with different tariffs and different trade policies? So it seemed to me like Tiff Macklem was opting to save his ammunition for a later date. So, I mean, the takeaway for me anyways was it seemed like a dovish presser, but I don't know, Keith, Rich, what you took away from it.
Well, I was a little surprised. I mean, if we did have the Twinkie bet, I probably would have had them leaning towards a cut. So,
that was my view.
Yeah, I thought that we would have been. And it's also really weird because the best case scenario from a central bank perspective is that we continue on the current trend and path we were headed on anyway, which was clearly a case for them to continue cutting, right? That's where but the other case was something which was much worse, where they should be cutting. So again, it just didn't reconcile from a logical perspective, which direction they went with this one. But for a central bank to cut 7 times and then pause, regardless of why they paused, usually means they could be there for now for a while. And I still think they will end up cutting, because I think economic conditions have the opportunity to deteriorate significantly coming up. So we'll see where we go with it. But I was a little bit surprised by the pause. How about you, Rich?
No, my question is, isn't the yield curve sort of doing a lot of the work for them? If that's my question, you know what I mean? So like, why did they cut? They cut because inflation ostensibly is back to target. they cut to, even though they would never say the following, they cut to bail out homeowners because they had extremely high debt servicing costs. They're cutting to help employment, I guess. I don't know. But, on other than employment, the other two factors have definitely improved. So you have inflation's back to target, and debt servicing ratios are starting to fall. And the mortgage rates, they're, as Steve has a better handle on this than I do, but mortgage rates are back to levels where people can absorb those renewals. So, I mean, haven't they sort of met all of their, let's say, inverted commas criteria?
I mean, more or less. I mean, obviously there's still people coming off of mortgage rates that were fixed at, call it 1.5%, that today will renew at 4%. So it's an adjustment, but keep in mind, there's also a lot of mortgages that, where it took 2 or 3 year terms in 2022, 2023 that have already kind of renewed and actually are renewing at lower rates. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think the mortgage renewal wall is a little bit overhyped. But yeah, I mean,
yeah, I know. I guess in my head, I'm just saying, like, I mean, I'm trying to sort of be the devil's advocate here and say like, well, they've met, ostensibly they are at target. So why don't we just move on? Like, so why don't we just take a pause and worry about, something else? I don't know. I didn't really understand the language. I think could we talk about the statement? Because I thought that was the craziest part.
Yeah, do that. That was a good one, Rich. Go ahead.
Because, like, to me, I didn't listen to the presser. Normally I do, but so I just read the statements. So, by the way, anybody and everybody can read the statements. They're free and very easy to look up on the Bank of Canada website, and they're published in time with the release. And he said, good morning, I'm pleased to be here, blah, blah, blah. And what I thought was really interesting was third paragraph: the Canadian economy ended 2024 in good shape. And I was like, what? I had to do like a double take, because back to the point, like, why do you cut? Well, you cut to, like, because you think you're in economy's recession. They're trying to, prop up or support demand. You're adding liquid, you know what I mean? All these reasons. And they cut 50 basis points, and they were aggressive in their language. And they were literally told us just a couple of months ago, they're worried about the economy. And now all of a sudden he says the economy's in good shape. So I was like, I just thought that was fascinating.
Maybe that was John Manley talking instead of the squirmer.
But yeah, did you guys not catch that? I mean, I thought it was bizarre.
Well, I mean, one thing about a central banker, though, it doesn't matter if it's Canadian, American, or European, or whatever, you always have to have this steady hand all the time. And, like, that's one of the compliments that Carney got when he was back as Bank of Canada governor, back during the 08-09 crisis. I met a lot of business leaders back then, and they all say, he walked into a room and things, it wasn't a fun time, but he did walk in with confidence and provided that sense everything is going to be okay. So I'm not surprised.
Yeah, Halifax is really getting to your head, eh?
Yeah, I know. I got to get out more. But anyway, it's you should expect to hear that stuff. But I think, though, we are looking forward here, and we're getting economic data monthly, which is it ex ante? Is that what they call it, Rich? It's after the fact, of course. Mm-hmm. And Rich, you and I were chatting yesterday, and you made the comment that earnings estimates haven't changed yet, and I said, well, why don't you wait a few minutes? And I think over the last day now, we're starting to see companies warn and guide lower. And I think so that's more forward looking. Yeah. So I think as the central banks, as they start to get more data on that, you could see them getting a bit more dovish.
There was one statement that stood out for me. I was listening to the press conference. So Macklem said, quote, the removal of the consumer carbon tax will lower the entire CPI basket by 0.7% for this year. There you go.
He also said that, though, last December as well, right? And January. And
I don't remember the exact messaging he gave out.
No, he didn't. He didn't say that at all.
Not? What did he say?
Of course he didn't.
I think they tried to say it was kind of like it was going to be a marginal reduction in CPI. And like, the thing is like where people get confused, I think he was trying to say, well, it's going to be a one-time adjustment. Well, of course, because it's a base effect, right? Like, but like structurally, I mean, it's a cost on production, right? So
On everything.
on everything. Yeah,
Except steel. No steel.
Except steel.
But like Rich, I mean, 0.7% on your CPI basket, like that's a lot.
On a monthly basis or for the whole year?
He said
It's
on
for the whole year,
I think it was
annualized.
for the whole
Yeah.
year. Like I think it was on average was my understanding. Will lower the entire CPI basket by about 0.7% for the year.
Yeah,
So
if
again,
if your target is 2 with a range of 1 to 3, then 0.7 is a substantial chunk of that.
then
So
that was
that's
sort of
likely
how
why
I
they
interpreted it.
Sorry.
So that's likely why they paused then. I mean, I didn't get to spend a lot of time on yesterday's meeting, but that's a good point, Steve. What else did you hear?
Oh yeah, I don't know. I think there's one guy. I don't know who it is. I don't know his name, but there's one reporter every time. I don't know how many pre-sales this guy owns, but every time he goes, "Did you consider 50 basis points?"
Is he the Indian sounding fella?
Yeah. He's the
Yeah,
Indian
I remember
reporter,
him.
and he
He's
keeps
always asking if there's more
his
cuts
only
coming.
question is like, why not jumbo cut? And I don't know how many pre-sale this guy's long, but it's like he's like you can see Carolyn Rogers, like she's just kind of like almost like containing a laugh, like she's like smirking. It's like, I mean, how do you answer that?
See, that's where we would do, if we were the central bankers, we would add a bit of personality to the presser, which I think is needed every now and then.
Yeah.
Why not 100?
All I want to say on the carbon tax thing was it just reinforces what I think a lot of people who have been thinking about it and writing about it for many, many, many years, which is that it is in essence inflationary. And I think not only has the work and by the way, there was also work in the monetary policy report about that. I think that was the other thing. There's like lots of work on trade policy, but it's difficult to get a sort of gauge on what's going to happen and how long the tariffs are going to stay and if they're going to apply to this or that and whatever. So I wouldn't take too much stock in that. But the idea that putting a tax on a very, very important input is not increased prices is crazy. It doesn't make any sense.
They also laid out two economic scenarios, and so that's why they paused basically. And so the first scenario is that the effects of the tariff war starts to get a bit muted. They're expecting Q2 to be a bit sluggish or soft, and then things will stabilize, and they expect inflation to remain low, and that's their base case. I got the impression of, and then they said the second scenario is when we get basically a hard recession for a full year. And with, I think they indicated high inflation coming through, which would make sense as well. My take would be, I think the second scenario is more likely than the first scenario. So the second one, I would have that as the base case. Because remember, there's still, for him to indicate that, hey, Q2 will be slow, and then the economy will continue to recover and stuff like that. I think that is ignoring the negative momentum, if that's a word, that we had leading into this. Again, people are forgetting, before the tariff war started, there was not a lot of positive data coming out for Canada and other countries at the same time. But at least though they did spell out two scenarios, I just think they have them in the wrong order of the most.
Sorry, Keith, you're wrong. In the Canadian economy ended 2024 in good shape. I'm joking. That's what he said in the press conference. No, I agree with you, obviously. But anyway, okay, I'll leave you to
Keith, we also had, before we jump over to our interview here, we had the ECB today. They announced a 25 basis point cut. Any surprises there?
No, I mean, everyone right now, I mean, they're using the tariff war as an excuse for any kind of a policy change whatsoever. So nothing really jumped out from the ECB that they did cut. But just comparing the Bank of Canada with the Fed and what's expected going forward for the rest of this year, markets are pricing in the Canadians to cut by 50 basis points for the year. So half 100, that'll get us to 2.25. So people on their variable rate mortgage, that might be nice for you. And the Fed is expected to cut by 75 basis points. Unless the chair of the Fed is fired, then it could be 175 by the next guy. But that still would leave a difference of 3.5 to 2.25, between the Americans and the Canadians. And that doesn't quite make sense. So these expectations will change as we move along here now into the spring.
Yeah, so obviously lots to keep track of. Of course, Trump was out tweeting or on Truth Social, the account that he uses, obviously pushing Powell there to cut rates and arguing that it can't come soon enough for Jay Powell to leave. So obviously the politicization of central banks, Keith, I think has been around for a long time, despite their suggested notion that they are independent.
Very much so.
Who's been around long? Powell, you mean, or the central bank?
No, I mean the notion that central banks are obviously operating independently, I think is debatable. But
yeah, I agree, Steve. It is debatable, and but that's in theory is the way it should be. Absolutely. At the same time, let's not be naive. There's always things going on underneath the surface, and they are aware of and exposed to a lot more information than three of us babbling turds are exposed to. And so sometimes they might do something or say something that might not make sense with the narratives that we're hearing. But again, they have access to way better information. And the same with the Europeans and everyone else.
yeah. So before we jump over to our Doomberg interview this week, I want to remind everybody that if you're listening to this, the three of us have a webinar coming up on April 21st, Easter Monday at 4 p.m. Pacific time. We're going to chat sort of global markets, Canadian housing. Keith, anything else you want to add in there?
No, I think that's it. Three of those.
That's
a lot of stuff in there.
Yeah, but we're going to open it up to like Q&A and sort of, yeah. So if anyone listening just want to tune in, or if you got, some more specific questions and you got some spare time on Easter Monday, 4 p.m. Pacific time, there is a link in the show notes. So if you're on YouTube or Spotify or Apple, if you go to the description, there is a Zoom webinar registration link where you can sign up and tune into that. So looking forward to chatting with a lot of you listeners. That is Monday, Easter Monday, coming up at 4 p.m. Pacific time. But without further ado, let's jump over to our interview with the Green Chicken, Doomberg. Doomberg, welcome back to the Loonie Hour, second appearance.
Hey, great to be back. I'm just thrilled that you're still willing to have guests based in the U.S. on your show. I mean,
well, we almost, it was a close call a couple weeks ago with Brent Johnson, who I'm sure you're familiar with.
Of course. Yeah, good.
Elbows up, whatever the hell that means.
Hey, you look. Yeah. Did you get a haircut? You look a bit sharper there today.
Trying to stay fit. Getting my daily walks in, and found a new barber and keeping trim. As you reach a certain age in life, you have to work a little harder at such things. But judging by the appearance of the three of you, I think we're all in the same boat.
Yeah. So Doomberg, when we last had you on, I think it's been about a year. The conversation was around. We viewed, and you viewed in particular, that the politics in Canada when Trudeau was there was clearly going to turn a different direction. And you also then wrote a piece, I think several months later, probably about 6 months later, maybe, called Alberta Clipper. Can you kind of walk us through that just summary of that piece?
Yeah, sure. We wrote and published that piece in early December, and looking back at 2024, when you're in the analysis business like we are, every once in a while you do a look back and see how you did, compare your predictions to how reality subsequently unfolded. And we would rank Alberta Clipper as our number one most prescient piece of 2024 of the 90 or 95 or so that we published. In that article, Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives were sitting at about 93% probability of winning the next Canadian federal election. And there were some rumblings about Mark Carney, but we know Canadian politics pretty well for an American-based newsletter for a variety of reasons, including the composition of the members of our team. And I, in particular, I'm pretty familiar with how Canadian politics really works, and I'm a bit cynical in that regard. And we started to pick up the pattern recognitions that Carney was being positioned to replace Trudeau, who was clearly sort of dead man walking politically. And Carney, as we described in Alberta Clipper, is a globalist delight. All the right, very important appointments with very important capitalized. And it just seemed like the fix was in. And so we predicted in Alberta Clipper that one, Mark Carney would replace an ejected Justin Trudeau ahead of any election. And two, given the notoriously pliant Canadian media and its bent towards supporting the Liberal Party in general, that Mark Carney would have a far more likely chance of winning the election than pundits were currently giving him credit for. And in fact, when we published that piece, Mark Carney was not even a contract on Polymarket. And as we hit record today, he's sitting at 75% likelihood that he's going to win. Now, we have a rule that we don't invest in things that we write about broadly. And if we do, like gold, for example, it's not something we're affecting the price. But the one time we wish we had invested on our idea was going as long as we could Mark Carney when the contract was first live. And then we also speculated about how the ascension of Mark Carney into the position of prime minister might trigger successionist stirrings in Alberta. And we're an energy-focused newsletter, and the future of Alberta is of deep interest to us, given the size of the Western Canada sedimentary basin and its impact on global energy flows. And so that was Alberta Clipper. We've since written 2 follow-up pieces, including one just earlier this week, where we sort of tripled down on our predictions. But none of what has transpired with Carney and Trudeau, and even the sort of the trajectory of the election has surprised us. The details of how it went down with Trump and his role in it, of course, nobody could have predicted, but that was Alberta Clipper, and it was a fun piece to write, and it's been extra fun to see how those predictions have aged.
So yeah, what do you see as the future? Like, I mean, I guess the big question mark, and I am sure you're quite familiar with Carney's past. Obviously, you wrote a book called Values, which is essentially a book about ESG. Do you foresee him harnessing Canada's natural resource sector? Do you think there's like sort of a come to Jesus moment that he will change his views and actually achieve that, or do you have a view on that?
Yeah. So before we get there, in the second piece we wrote, I just want to say we concluded, for reasons we still don't understand, that Donald Trump preferred Carney and would put his thumb on the scale, either through bad actions intended to help Carney or through helping Carney by coming to agreements with him on tariffs and so on, and that he just torpedoed Trudeau. And so that's an important part of this whole answer to your question. But in the piece we just published yesterday, called "The Fix Is In," we made some pretty bold predictions. And if they don't pan out, we can always write about why we were wrong. But I think the most important thing to understand about what's likely to transpire in the months ahead is you first have to discard the notion that people like Carney actually believe the things they say and write. And look, we're very cynical, so you just have to take this with a grain of salt. But our track record on assuming cynicism as an input into a model that is predictive is pretty good. So one does not become the head of the central banks of both Canada and England, or the chair of the board at Brookfield Asset Management, or the puppet of choice of the elites who actually control Canada by being a maverick thinker, right? Who always comes forth with original ideas. And we wrote in the piece, it's more accurate to think of Carney like a boat captain whose sails are always perfectly positioned for the wind of the day, which is a pretty reasonable thing to do when you're handed a weather forecast in advance. And our view is, for reasons we don't understand, the winds of change are blowing in Canada, and the powers that be have finally decided to get serious about building the infrastructure needed to unstick Alberta's energy. Alberta is often called the Texas of Canada, but unlike Texas, Texas has hundreds of miles of coasts with several really amazing deep water ports, which allows them to move their product, from the wellhead to the world with excellent logistics, whereas Alberta is not only landlocked, but its closest path to a major body of water, the Pacific Ocean, is bisected by the Rocky Mountains, which is a takeoff capacity logistics nightmare. And so all of Alberta's energy basically that is exported flows south to the US, and it's stuck. For whatever reason, all of this talk about green energy and climate change, we are predicting in this piece is going to fall to the wayside. But Carney, when he wins on Monday, on the 28th, which we're still predicting he will do, the close polls being thrown about in the media notwithstanding, which I think is just sort of cover to make it look like it was close and that the fix wasn't in. Once he becomes prime minister, can't really walk away from that legacy without a good excuse. Covering fire, as we call it in the political world. And the covering fire for Carney to turn his back on years of sort of climate change newspeak will be a constitutional crisis provoked by Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta. And that constitutional crisis will be blown into, several stories, and there will be scathing editorials on both sides, and it'll look like it's an open, honest debate. But in reality, the purpose of that constitutional crisis will be twofold. One, to finally settle the Quebec issue. And two, to be the reason, the excuse for the Liberal Party led by Mark Carney to walk away from the climate change agenda. Protests against all of this will be muted compared to the protests that sunk the Energy East pipeline and the Quebec natural gas pipeline and all of that stuff. And the media just won't cover it because they will be instructed not to cover it. The most divisive politician of our times, Donald Trump, and I say divisive in quotes, will leave Canada more united than it's ever been. Its confederation finally formalized and its energy resources unlocked. And then as we close the piece, the fix is in. The opening story for that piece was the Calgary Stampede and its American roots. Say what you want about Trump, he makes for quite the rodeo director. So that's our piece. It all hinges on Carney winning the election. And even though he might not be our preferred candidate, we've predicted it enough now that we kind of hope he does for our own reputation's sake. But it was a fun piece to write. We have a fair number of Canadian subscribers, and our American and global readers tend to enjoy learning about Canada. All of this sort of friction between the countries now, I think, is just sort of, temporary at best. So anyway, that was the piece. That's our prediction. I'm happy to go in any direction that you find interesting.
Rich, do you have any thoughts there?
I have more questions on renewable energies and that kind of thing. So I'll push that maybe to a little bit later in the interview. My question is, I'm just sort of blown away by one. I guess I'm just very, very naive. And I think that that's my role on the podcast, is to just, what behind the ears, I suppose. I tend to believe people when they say things and when they commit their entire adult life to a crusade. But it's nice to hear that maybe that's not true. What is your view on, related to Carney and related to oil and gas? What's your view on net zero? Like, it's something that he talked a lot about in his book. And can you explain A, what it is, and B, if it's at all serious, and should our listeners take it seriously, and should, politicians that fight for it be derided?
So yeah, net zero is a fantasy that will never be implemented. So let's take a step back and maybe go on a bit of a tangent. Energy is life. Your standard of living is defined by how much energy you personally get to waste. And I use the word waste with purpose because you can't impose order on your local environment without wasting heat. The second law of thermodynamics. All humans everywhere want a higher standard of living. So the human demand for energy is infinite. It's gated only by production. It's cyclical, of course, because the length of the energy investment capital cycle can be different than the business cycle, but the arc of the human endeavor is an upward sloping energy demand curve with a slight sinusoidal wave aspect to it. And in a net zero world, we are satisfying the world's, humanity's energy demands with a balanced carbon emission. In other words, any CO2 that we're emitting to produce that heat is being offset somewhere. And in 1995, the world embarked on the climate agenda. That was the year of the first COP meeting, the United Nations, these COP meetings that have become so large and really carnivals at this point. The first one was in 1995. And in that year, humanity derived 87% of its primary energy from hydrocarbon fuels. And in 2023, the last year for which the Statistical Review of World Energy released comprehensive data, that number was 81%, despite trillions of dollars being invested chasing renewable energy unicorns. And the growth in hydrocarbon consumption from 1995 to 2023 was 60%. We have developed what we call Doomberg's postulate, which says every molecule of fossil fuel produced worldwide will be consumed by somebody somewhere, and local restrictions against such activities merely change who gets to enjoy that privilege. And a classic example is coal. The Western world has bent over backwards to reduce its coal demand, and China is now responsible for 55% of the world's coal consumption, and it's growing at record pace. They are greedily and happily consuming coal at a cheaper price than they would otherwise be doing because we have decided to wean ourselves off it. And so we might care about carbon emissions, but Brazil and India and China and Indonesia and Pakistan don't. And there's way more of them than there are of us. And who are we to tell them they can't develop? Net zero is a weird fantasy, the origins of which I still don't understand. Was never going to work. To get ahead in the system that Carney excelled at getting ahead in, you had to write such books and you had to say such things. And it's incredibly easy to swim with the current, right? And look, he's a globalist delight. He's Harvard and Oxford and Goldman Sachs and central banker and Brookfield Asset Management and pick your favorite. He was one of the boards of the WEF. Before that was sort of a stain to have on your resume, pre-COVID, I guess. And so there's a whole cadre of such people who specialize in saying the correct thing in the moment for advancement. And I would put him as an A+ student in that regard. He's a highly intelligent man. He's not. When we say puppet, we're kind of being facetious a little bit, but he's obviously a brilliant man. And whoever it is that has, one of our views is whatever the media is telling you is going on is not the actual thing that's going on, especially during major periods of change. And why do we say that? You go back past 100 years and you read historical events as historians now understand them, and then you compare that to the way the media contemporaneously was reporting it, is never the same. So why would it be the same today, right? And so we developed a model in December that Trump wanted Carney in, and that has proved incredibly prescient. And
can you
sure.
elaborate on that? Why?
Yeah, I want to pull in that thread just because I'm kind of curious, obviously, where that leads to.
So we pride ourselves as being sort of lateral thinkers, right? And a lateral thinker is willing to negate and willing to assume absurd as axiomatic to see if such an assumption proves as a better predictor, right? And so we were observing Trump's behavior vis-a-vis Trudeau. And the meeting in Mar-a-Lago after Trump initially threatened tariffs, and what emerged from that meeting was the 51st state and the Governor Trudeau talk. And, there's a history of Trump with Brookfield Asset Management that predates Carney's time there as the chair of the board, but it is material. You can go online and Google it, and maybe you're familiar with it, maybe you're not. But Trump knows every billionaire in the United States, and there's plenty of them that emerge from Brookfield. And it just seemed to us that he never expressed support for the conservatives of Canada, but he was relentlessly crushing Trudeau. And, always negate, always invert. That's sort of the mindset of the lateral thinker. We developed a hypothesis internally that maybe Trump actually wants Carney in the seat. And look, when we wrote this thing in the first week of December, like I said, Carney was not even a contract on Polymarket, but we had seen enough stories in the Canadian media, which we follow closely, the beginnings of pattern recognition that Carney would be the one that would be elevated, and the timing of Trump just relentlessly crushing Trudeau seems suspicious to us. And so when we develop a hypothesis like that, and we probably develop 8 of them that for each one that works, but as you get more and more data and the hypothesis isn't nullified, then it becomes like the scientific method more viable.
But why though? But like, I know it's
we don't know
difficult
why. Well, it's a very important point for lateral thinking, Richard, which is the why doesn't matter, it's the what.
Okay.
Right? Like it's nice to understand the why for confirmation, but not always, because then you might get stuck on something that has changed because you think of the why and it's certain. So as we say in the piece, the model need not be right, it just needs to work. It might not even be that Trump preferred Carney. We developed a model that Trump prefers Carney, and let's see how that explains the world.
Fair.
Now, and in the second piece that we wrote, I just want to say, we called it, look for the 51st state and the governor talk to abate once Carney becomes prime minister. And the first post on Truth Social that Trump did, he called him prime minister of Canada.
True. Yeah.
Which is not an unimportant thing. Very confirmatory of our hunch. So sorry, somebody was about to ask. I just wanted to make that point.
Ever been abroad and needed Wi-Fi? Download Saley. Tired of telecom oligopolies ripping you off? Download Saley. Want to avoid sketchy SIM sellers at the airport? Download Saley. Saley might be the only travel app you need. It provides an internet connection wherever you travel and saves you money on roaming fees. It's easy to use, affordable, and reliable all over the world. Saley is the modern, seamless way to get connected without the need for physical SIM cards. With eSIM technology, you can instantly activate service from anywhere in the world. No more waiting in line for a local SIM or dealing with expensive roaming charges. Saley offers flexible plans to fit your needs, whether you're traveling for work or leisure. Plus, you can switch between networks in just a few taps, ensuring you always get the best coverage at the best rates. Whether you're a frequent traveler, an expat, or just someone who wants more flexibility with their phone, Saley's got you covered. No hidden fees, no contracts, just affordable, reliable data wherever you go. Visit Saley.com/Loonie Hour for 15% off.
Yeah, we love stories like this on the Loonie Hour because we can connect them. But let's make the assumption that is what is desired by the Americans, to have Carney elected as prime minister. I'm trying to reconcile now, though. How does Carney and call it the globalist agenda, or whatever he's backed for the previous 15 years plus, all of a sudden change the course of direction for Canada away from focusing on like capping emissions or focusing on clean energy to the opposite goal? That's what I'm finding. Is it simply follow the money here? They're going to get paid for it, so they'll do it, or is there something else?
So this is where we might, wander into a bit tinfoil territory. So when I think of the globalists, I sort of think of two camps. I think of the Atlanticists and everybody else. So if you draw a map, you draw a circle on a map around the UK, Canada, and the United States, that's sort of the inner core. And then there's the rest of the West, right? Western Europe and a few other countries, Japan, South Korea. And the UK is always sort of in the middle of all of this, and very strong connections to Canada, but also has ambitions in Europe that are probably run counter to the European elite, the Germans in particular, and the old expression about the purpose of NATO. And so I think when you said Americans support Carney, I want to correct you. Trump is supporting Carney, and Trump has a very different agenda than the people he replaced in America. America's a very divided country. Trump's agenda is, hey, we lost the war in Ukraine. We're overextended. We've outsourced our military supply chains to China, and China's our greatest enemy. What have we done? Why are we poking around with the Russian bear? And I want to focus on the Western world. Trump, want to focus on the Western hemisphere. We have all we need here in the Western hemisphere to become a global, perhaps the strongest superpower in a multipolar world that includes China and Russia as a united front. And in order to get the Western world in order, we need to unstick Alberta's energy. The whole talk about Greenland, Panama Canal, bringing Brazil back into the fold, the deal with Mexico, knocking out the cartels so we can exploit that energy, overthrowing Maduro in Venezuela, which is on the cards, it's coming. We wrote a piece called Misreading the Room. Look, Venezuela used to produce 4 million barrels a day of oil. Now it produces barely 1. It's got a very similar resource base to Canada. It just has a different political and contract structure. And so that's why it's not being developed. So in a world where the Western Hemisphere is the U.S.'s backyard, the old Monroe Doctrine 2.0. As we said at the end of the fix is in, our belief is U.S. energy dominance will be rebranded as North American energy dominance. And in a world where you get the UK to sign on to that vision, and you leave the Ursula von der Leyens of the world twisting in the wind, which I think the British would be fine and more than happy to do, then it all starts to make sense. And so, as we said in the piece, if Carney's going to be handed a weather forecast that says tomorrow the wind will blow in this direction, he's just going to reroute his sails. And the cover needed for that is a nice, good old-fashioned constitutional crisis. And in our piece, with the picture of Daniel Smith, with the caption was "Best Actress in a Drama." And we're very deeply cynical about these things, and it only because it's a model that has proved predictive over time. And so it's kind of fun to speculate. And look, the nice thing about our work is we publish 8 to 10 times a month, and we could always publish, hey, we got it wrong, and here's why. And so no matter what happens on the 28th, we have a piece at the ready. The title for the piece, if the Conservatives win, is "Nobody Bats 1,000."
I mean, it makes sense to me. I think what you're saying here. I mean, obviously, Rich, we've talked about it on the podcast, which is, the idea that the United States is putting a tariff on Canadian oil doesn't make a whole lot of sense, other than to obviously, I think, stir the political winds to some extent and obviously rally up. I mean, clearly what's happened with the tariffs, Carney has leveraged to his situation today, which is everyone's saying, well, his whole campaign is not about what we've done over the past 10 years as a Liberal Party. It's
Correct.
I'm the number one guy to stand up to Donald Trump and negotiate. Look at my resume.
Right.
And
look, we said in the piece, we expect Trump and Carney to swiftly strike a favorable deal on tariffs, which will pad, Carney's resume and his political capital just when it's needed most to turn his back on the green energy agenda and cut a deal with Alberta and Quebec. And you get that pipeline built straight to the Irving refinery in New Brunswick, and everybody wins, right? So I mean, it's I'm old enough to remember when Frank McKenna won all 58 seats in New Brunswick. I mean, let's not kid ourselves about the state of Canadian democracy. So the media is aligned with all of these moves, and we think that's what's going to happen. And
so,
go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, so, I mean, again, just so, I mean, what I'm hearing from that is that Canada will unlock its incredible natural resources. And in my view, that is part and parcel with, which will unlock its incredible energy resources. And I think that's part and parcel with unlocking its natural resources, i.e. all the critical minerals, which I think this is all really all about. Excuse me, not all about, but you know what I mean? It's a major factor in Donald Trump's pivot with respect to Greenland and blah, 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 is the natural resources that Canada just, for some reason, insists on keeping in the ground. Do you see it that way as well? Because you need cheap energy to process these minerals, et cetera?
100%. And I think the Arctic plays a key role in this. The combination of Alaska, the Canadian territories, and Greenland make a very powerful entree into the Arctic, where I think there's just an enormous amount of resources. And look, the war in Ukraine has produced many catastrophes, starting, of course, with the impact on the people of Ukraine. But from a diplomatic perspective, the greatest catastrophe of them all is the fact that we have driven Russia into China's arms. And Russia and China are, despite centuries of tension, incredibly complementary.
Yeah, I know.
You have.
Can you explain why, just quickly?
Sure.
Right.
The world's largest producer of commodity, well, second now compared to the U.S., and the world's largest consumer of them, China. And so, what is China missing? It imports 4 million barrels a day of oil. Who has excess oil? We've been arguing and screaming really from the rooftops since 2022 that the sanctions policies were designed to backfire. The U.S. Navy should be escorting every Russian oil tanker to the market to drive the price of oil down as much as possible to rob Putin of profits. You don't make money on volume in this business. You make money on price, right? And so the escalating prices driven by the sanctions policy is what kept the war machine in Russia going, and now we've lost that war. And today, Russia and China have never been closer. We're putting a piece out on Taiwan here next about hypersonic missiles and Taiwan's unique energy vulnerabilities and how the U.S. just has no hope of winning a war or defending Taiwan. And I don't know why we launched a trade war when we don't have escalation dominance, even though Trump thinks we do. One of the reasons you don't start wars is because you often lose them. And so, the catastrophe of driving Russia and China closer together, and they have never been closer together. One of the models you could use to observe the war in Ukraine is a proxy war between the US and China, where Ukraine is fighting on behalf of the US and Russia is fighting on the behalf of China. I mean, Russia is feeding the Chinese war machine with ammunition and all manner of other financial and commodity support, and the same can be said, the U.S. and its Western allies for Ukraine. And look, Russia won that war. Like we probably not reported as such in Canada yet, but that war, which saw NATO throw everything it had into the battle, hasn't been going very well. And so I think that's kind of panicked the Trump wing. And a way to model the U.S. is sort of Trump, Pentagon versus intelligence community, Wall Street. And Trump Pentagon realizes what's happened to the supply chains because of the financialization driven by the adventures of the CIA and Wall Street's desire to have, quarterly profits at the expense of resiliency. It's very difficult to put a market price on national security in a true free market capitalist economy like the U.S. has been running. And so the Pentagon desperately understands the weaknesses that have evolved because of its reliance on Russia. We've said
reliance on China, you mean?
Yeah, reliance on China. Sorry, that China is the new arsenal of democracy because it makes all the weapons that the Western world uses, right? And so you can't fight a war with the people that are making your weapons
or ships,
right? They produce like orders of magnitude more ships than the U.S. The U.S. doesn't build anything anymore. So Trump's tariff policy, in a way, is logical. It's whether the friction of the transition can be survived, especially given his political capital, in order to see it through.
Can I ask you one more question? I know Keith wants to jump in there, but just I've made the case repeatedly that so much of this stuff we see is a distraction, Russia, etc. The real fault line in the next, let's say, century, our lives, is between China and the U.S. Would that be fair? I know it's a huge question.
100%. No, 100%. This is the thesis of our next piece. Okay. And there we're making the same mistakes. I mean, I'll give you a preview if you're interested. Taiwan imports 99% of its fossil fuels and relies on fossil fuels for 81% of its electricity. And one LNG import terminal is responsible for 60 or 65% of its natural gas. It's 188 miles from the coast of China, and a hypersonic missile could take it out in 2 minutes. And there was an affair in November in Ukraine that has been wildly underreported in the West, but we think is important, which is Russia test launched the Saretsky missile. Have you guys ever heard of this missile? So the Saretsky missile is a hypersonic missile that Putin later, which was pretty interesting that he publicly commented on it, claimed could fly at Mach 10, and that there were no known countermeasures in the world to it. In other words, no air defense system, not the Iron Dome, not the US's most sophisticated systems that could counter it. And they fired a missile into Ukraine at a aerospace and defense contractor, major facility in Dnipro. And it has 6 warheads on it. And they only fired dummy warheads, but the kinetic energy of a dummy warhead at Mach 10 was such that on Russian media, they were claiming pulverized vast swaths of underground facilities. And this was a warning to Biden for having launched long-range missiles into traditional Russia. The U.S. stopped doing that after the Saretsky was launched. And China and Russia have been collaborating, right? And China is in possession of hypersonic missiles. And maybe in exchange for a lot of help in the war in Ukraine, Russia, shared some technology with China. And if China's in possession of similar technology, within 2 minutes, it could knock out Taiwan's complete energy grid. It has a 5.5 gigawatt hour coal plant and a 7.5 gigawatt hour natural gas plant that account for 25% of its electricity. There's not many targets that would need to be hit with such a missile for Taiwan to be rendered in a state such that surrender would be the only option. And this would be in minutes before the US could even muster a response. This is what we call escalation dominance. That's the name of the piece that we're publishing on. And, you know, I think in a world where, as you said in your question, the confrontation between China and the US is the major dominant geopolitical issue of the next 20 years. The flashpoint for such a confrontation, everybody assumes, is going to be Taiwan, for good reason. It's a red line for China, and Taiwan's home to 90% of the world's semiconductor production. So why is China embarking on a multi-decade billion-dollar national priority project to become self-sufficient in semiconductors? When you look at the pieces on the board, pattern recognition, lateral thinking, this is clearly where things are headed. And our next piece is a bit of a warning. Hopefully some people in the Trump administration read it. Like, we're not in as powerful a position as we think we might be in this regard. And one of the things the US has done repeatedly in the past 30, 40 years is assume it could win very difficult wars quickly because of some technological dominance that isn't really determinative. And so that's where our brains are today.
Yeah, I love the conversation. Thank you for sharing this with everyone. So, I mean, I think it's clear the Americans are looking to expand their energy exploration and production. Canadian synergy should help with that as well. Russia is paired with China. Share a little bit of your ideas. What happens with the Middle East and the Saudis and in the other countries over there that are also producing energy? Do they have a mad scramble going on, or is their supplies affected? Like, how does it, because they used to be the center of the world for energy, obviously it is moving a little bit elsewhere with importance. Have you guys looked at that?
Sure, we have. But before I do, I just want to correct again. You use the word American, and in our view, there's two Americas. And I don't think it's a correct assumption to assume that there's a cohesive American strategy. And all you need to observe is the bit flip between Biden and Trump because of a few swing states in the Middle East to see that, in fact, there are two Americas. And one of the Americas is currently in control. So I think it's important to refer to Trump's agenda or the MAGA agenda or the Pentagon's agenda instead of Wall Street's in this regard. But to your question, something very bizarre happened on the Thursday after Liberation Day. We've written about it. It was a sit up in our chair and stare at the screen in awe moment, which is when OPEC poured oil on an already burning tape. The stock market was collapsing. It was the Thursday after Trump announced this bizarre set of tariffs. And oil dropped $10 in a flash because OPEC decided that it would accelerate its lifting of production cuts, sort of threefold, which was a bizarre thing to do. And so as we wrote at the time, for weeks, Russia, the US, and Saudi Arabia have been engaged in high-stakes diplomacy. And the cover story for that diplomacy is the war in Ukraine. But again, back to our earlier point, history tells us that the cover story is never the reality. And deeper discussions are clearly going on. And those three countries are by far the largest oil and gas producers in the world. And their combination is stronger than OPEC. And a deal was cut. Like, we don't know why. We don't know what was given in return. But the piece we wrote on it was called Punctuated Equilibrium. And again, we don't need to understand the what, the why to understand the what or try to predict the what. But OPEC has been on the verge of failing for many, many years for reasons we can get into. Trump wants $50 oil. And Saudi Arabia has decided it could live with $50 oil. Now, again, I don't know what the trade was in return for that. Someday we'll find out when historians unpack what transpired. But that was a highly unusual thing for OPEC to do in the middle of a market panic that they had to know would kneecap the price of oil, and it did. And so I can't say that I understand it. I just observed it with keen interest.
Can I ask you just a quick question on that? So sorry, this is a bit off piece, but I think I really want to know. What's the break-even oil for the oil sands? Oil price, excuse me, for the oil sands, roughly? Do you know?
So last I heard, it was around 40 to 50, but inflation has probably happened since then. break-even price is an interesting concept. So one of the things, again, that we wrote about recently is that people need to actually play the pieces out on the board as they lie, and that was the name of the piece, as the pieces lie. There are now 3 types of energy producers. There are producers who produce only crude oil. There are producers who produce only natural gas. And then there are producers who produce both, associated production, right? You get lighter oil and natural gas liquids and natural gas all at once. And that middle group is new. It's a product of the shale revolution. But in the US today, 50% of the US's crude and 3/4 of its natural gas are co-produced. They're produced in tandem. And that's beginning to happen in that sort of Alberta, BC nexus, probably more so in BC, which is sort of the lighter, gassier part of the basin. But if you're co-producing, liquids and gas, your break-even price of liquids depends on the price of the gas a lot. And as we wrote in that piece, what if natural gas becomes more valuable than oil? In many ways, it should. It's cleaner burning, it's got more energy, far less impurities to worry about. It's very plentiful. The world has an infinite supply of natural gas for modeling purposes, at least on a human timescale. And forever, natural gas is traded at a discount to oil when corrected for energy, because it's a gas and it's harder to handle. And we don't have pipeline capacity to move it, and you have to freeze it to put it on a boat, and all of these other logistical constraints are real, and they're accounted for in the price. So if you just take the price of natural gas in dollars per million BTU, and you multiply it by 5.8, you'll get the price of natural gas in barrels of oil. And right now, in Alberta, which is landlocked, right? $2 a million BTU is what, $12 a barrel of oil? Like, that's how cheap natural gas is in Alberta, British Columbia. In the US, it's probably double that, so 24, except in the Permian, it's been mostly free or negative because they just have too much of it. Where most of those co-producers are, by the way, the people that produce both oil and natural gas. So forever, natural gas has been the product that has been flared or given away, or right? And in a world where natural gas is more valuable than oil, because say you're going to use it to power your AI data centers directly unconnected from the grid, where natural gas goes in one side of the building and data comes out the other, especially in Canada and British Columbia, where that would be favorable because it's cold there and half of the energy of a data center is in cooling, which is an easier problem to solve in British Columbia in the winter than Texas in the summer, I can assure you. The break-even price of Alberta, British Columbia hydrocarbons depends on the price of natural gas and natural gas liquids substantially. And this is a nuance that people who think the price of crude oil is impacted only by crude oil, inventories, production rates, demand, they'll miss that because hydrocarbons are fungible over the medium term. And in the long term, all hydrocarbons will sell for the same price, corrected for energy content and logistics. And so, when you ask me what is the break-even oil price for production in Alberta, it's a difficult question to answer because I don't know the sort of distribution of producers who are only producing heavy oil and have no gas. Where, on the other side of the Rockies, you probably have gas and NGLs and some crude. And so the nature of the question requires a bit more nuance and an understanding of where the energy markets are going.
Can I ask another question, boys? Do you mind? All right, just more
hogging the mic. It's unbelievable.
I love energy in this shit. This is like right up my alley. So can I? Okay, I'm gonna ask.
Yeah, fire away.
So all right. So the other thing is, so there's been a lot of talk about renewable energy, and I won't say his name, but a fan of ours wrote a very long email, basically, frankly, just criticizing my view that renewable energy over the short to medium term would, is basically BS, and cannot meet the storage, and cannot meet the energy needs of North America's growing power consumption. Can you explain if I'm wrong, if I'm right? Like, is the focus on wind appropriate? Does it lack the nuance that, I'm making a mistake with my previous question? Like, what's going on there? And is it as great as everybody basically keeps telling us?
At the risk of triggering a similar long letter into our inbox, wind and solar are fantasies. The crippling attribute that is always either papered over or frankly lied about is the fact that they're not dispatchable.
What does that mean?
Dispatchable means there when you need it, no matter what.
Okay. So it's the intermittency, because that's been my
intermittency is the Achilles heel, and there's no amount of storage that can save you from that. So even hydro, which actually is a giant battery, right? It's like one of the things about Quebec Hydro is that it's a giant battery. You can toggle the water levels behind the dam with very high precision to load match the needs of the grid. Even with hydro, intermittency, when measured over years, is such that you always go through periods of significant drought. And if your objective is 24-hour grid reliability, which is what you need for a grid to be reliable and beneficial to society, in other words, 1-2% decay in grid reliability crushes 10, 20, 30% of the value to society, right? And so take New Zealand, for example, which is heavily dependent on hydro. It's a perfect experience, very green grid. It went through a period of a multi-year drought. And if you don't have battery backup or natural gas backup to do that, to handle that, you have failed. And the cost of such backup scales with how little you need it, ironically.
Right.
Because that's a huge amount of capital that's not generating revenue. It's just there when you need it. So like in the US, whenever you get, there's a certain maximum threshold of wind and solar penetration, after which it becomes prohibitively expensive to operate the grid. Now, the big giant lie that I'm sure people like the author of the long email that you got sent either don't understand, which I give people the benefit of the doubt, or do understand and just power through anyway, is that levelized cost of electricity, the giant sleight of hand, is that this is what consumers pay for their electricity. And levelized cost of electricity is one of the giant frauds of our generation. This is, it's sort of the base assumption of it is that wind and solar's marginal cost is very low because the wind is free and the sun shines on its own. But making room for the intermittent nature of such electricity imposes upon the grid prohibitive costs that must be paid in order to use that electricity, but those costs are never counted in the quote-unquote cost of wind and solar.
Okay, so can you just repeat that in like layman's term, like really simply, so that...
All right, in order for me to make room for a wind turbine, right, sometimes that wind turbine produces a lot of electricity, and sometimes it produces none. There are times when I need a lot of electricity because the grid demands it, and the wind turbines just decide not to show up. I can't really predict that over a period of more than a few days. And since my goal is 99.9% grid reliability, I need to have at the ready some form of dispatchable power to step in at a moment's notice to make up for the unexpected windfall of a still day. And the cost of that wouldn't exist if we didn't have the wind turbine, but it is never ascribed to the wind turbine.
Got it.
And so anywhere in the country, and you could just draw a curve, percent renewable integration on one axis and final cost to the consumer of the grid, they're positively correlated. And in fact, exponentially slow above 25 to 30% penetration. You reach a wall. Why do you reach a wall? It's windy all at once for all the turbines, and it's still all at once for all the turbines. So the more turbines you put onto your grid, the larger the dispatchable backup that is a money loser, that is a drag, needs to be there for you, right? You see where this is going?
Crazy. Yeah, I know exactly where it's going. I'm just really happy you're spelling it out
so
well.
So yes, isolated at the turbine, it costs you nothing to produce that electricity. You pour the concrete, you put up the epoxy blades, they spin when it's windy, they don't when it isn't, and the levelized cost to the turbine is super cheap. The cost to use that electricity, which is what you and Keith and Steve pay, goes up because while the wind turbines are spinning, we are still paying the cost of capital of the natural gas peaker plant that is sitting idle. And there's no amount of batteries or natural gas plant or nuclear power plants that you can just throttle without having to pay them because they just can't be in business. So take France. 60, 70% of its electricity used to come from nuclear, and then they forced a bunch of renewables into it. What's going on? They have to throttle the nuclear power plants. The nuclear power plants don't make as much money. They squawk about it. The government has to bail them out. Worse still, the swinging on and off does damage to the plants, increases the maintenance costs, yada, yada, yada. They have to invest in new technologies to make all this work. None of those costs are ascribed into the political number, which is levelized cost of electricity.
Okay, so one more question, and then I promise to be quiet, which is like, you know this, we know this, all of our listeners now know this. Certainly Mark Carney knows this. Will this lie finally die?
Who knows? One of the great mysteries of our time, really, is the loss of fundamental physics as an input into policymaking, and its replacement with we call feel-goodism. This feels like it should be good, so we should do more of it. There is no replacing dispatchable power. Dispatchable power in a load matching grid is literally the foundation of all of our standard of living. It is difficult to articulate to those who have never lived without it just how valuable it is to flick a switch and have the light come on. Every time. How many times in your life have you flicked a switch and the light does not come on, and it's something other than a broken bulb, right? Like
there was an ice storm here once in 1994.
Sure. I remember it well. The great Montreal ice storm. We wrote about it once. When you live without electricity, by the way, for several weeks, as many of the victims of that ice storm did, you come to have a newfound appreciation for it. Now, one of the ways that you overcome intermittency is like what Hydro-Quebec has done, is you build an enormous amount of excess capacity. You run your hydro facilities at a lower capacity factor, and you are buffered against swings in rain and snowmelt over many, many years, and you pray that you never really need to make up for the shortfall, right? But even there, as I said, it's a challenge. And so the cost of all of that redundancy in Quebec is reflected in its power bills because that capital is being remunerated to Hydro-Quebec. But that's a rare thing. And by the way, that didn't come without its sacrifices, right? I mean, you reshaped entire landscapes. Indigenous lands were ravaged, and millions of caribou died, and all manner of things that would have been wholly unacceptable if you were drilling for natural gas. But hydro is clean, and so we just decide that hydro is clean, and clean is good, and green is good. By the way, I'll tell you a story. So everyone is like, freaked out, paranoid about nuclear reactors, right? Oh my God.
I'm not.
Right. I say everyone, I'm being sort of facetious. But
no, I know.
So 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, in China in 1975, there was a freak, 500-year storm, and a very large dam, whose name now escapes me, collapsed. And somewhere between, because nobody really knows, 50,000 and 250,000 people died. Nobody listening to this knows this story. It was a catastrophe of epic proportions. Did we run around the world and start taking down all of the hydro plants that we have? No. Chernobyl happened. Fukushima happened. The world went on. The world has this artificial fear of radiation. Like lots of ways people can die. Drowning's one of them. one hydro dam collapse in China was at least 50,000 people dead. And we just call hydro green. Like it really is amazing how certain technologies are treated in the zeitgeist. And it's just really quite remarkable. Go ahead, Steve. Look like you're about to.
Doomberg, yeah, I appreciate, obviously want to be respectful of your time. I was hoping to wrap it up with sort of a final question for you, which is, I think you eloquently highlighted, Trump's maybe desire for Carney to be PM. I think what we're hearing out of Carney obviously is, okay, we're going over to Europe. But out of all of this, do you actually expect Canada might end up with closer ties to the United States than we have today?
Yeah, and only Carney can do it, right? Like if the Conservatives were doing it, then the Liberal wing of Canada would be up in arms. But when it's your team that's negotiating the deal, which is one of the reasons why we think Carney needs to be the one that sort of turns the page on the green energy lunacy, it's a lot easier to sell to your side. And the Conservatives would be inclined, the Conservative, when I mean small c, the subset of the Canadians who are conservative that are, energy abundance types will go along with this because it is consistent with their philosophical worldview. It is almost not, it's very often the case that it requires somebody from the other side of the aisle to achieve the thing that your side of the aisle is hoping for.
Only Nixon could go to China.
Only Nixon could go to China, right? If a Democratic president had gone to China, they would have been lambasted as weak and red commie, all of this stuff. But Nixon had the resume, right? And so Carney is the only person who could really run cover on Canada turning that page, which is one of the reasons why we think that the fix is in. So
brilliant. Is there any particular projects that you think are the quickest to sort of green lighted, or something? Any one or two that are on your radar in particular?
Yeah, I think expanding the gas link project, the LNG project to British Columbia would be a big one. That gas is really trapped. It's the cheapest hydrocarbons on the board in the world. Alberta, British Columbia natural gas is the most affordable, cleanest burning hydrocarbon in the world. And it's sitting there trapped. It's selling at $12 a barrel oil. So I think that, and then I would look for a wave once, the tariffs are papered over and we all become, friends again. And by the way, like it is the destiny of Canada and the US to be incredibly close. The cultures are very similar. This current kerfuffle is a temporary one, which has a purpose. The media will go ahead and rerun the propaganda backwards when it's needed. And there's lots of reasons why, a shared history, why Canada and the U.S. Should be close and will be close. But, once Carney and Trump signed this great deal on tariffs, look for the big U.S. tech companies to pile into British Columbia and Alberta to build data centers and to power a joint AI strategy, North American AI strategy, those types of things, for the reasons I've articulated earlier. There's so much synergy between the two countries, but the disparity between the sort of energy agendas of the U.S. and Canada needed a reset, and that's why I think Carney is uniquely capable of executing that.
Well, I hope you're right in terms of a 180 on Canada's energy policy, and it certainly brought a lot of food for thought. Keith, Rich, I don't know if you have any parting words, but I think it's been, as always, a very enlightening conversation.
I just want to say thank you. I have millions more questions, but I guess I'll just have to subscribe to your newsletter.
Yes, and if anyone else wants to, you can go to Doomberg.com and pony up $300 US.
I'm already
that's like $5,000.
I like that to be known. I'm a longtime loyal subscriber, and will continue to be so. So anyone that's interested, that's listening to this, again, was it Doomberg, substack.com/Doomberg?
Just Doomberg.com. We ponied up and paid off the squatter who was on our domain name. And so now we are the proud owners of Doomberg.com, which is your one-stop shop for everything Doomberg. We have our articles. We publish about 90 to 95 a year. We also have a higher level tier for our pro subscribers, where in addition to our articles, we do a 1 hour or so long presentation once a month on a topic of interest. And all of our podcast appearances like this one are there under our Doomcast page. Hey guys, Steve, Richard and team is just great. Keith, really appreciated the time. Looking forward to the next appearance, assuming you don't get enough hate mail that will preclude you from having me back on.
No, absolutely. We'd love to have you on, and there'll be a link to your Substack as well in the show notes for all of our listeners. So highly encourage everyone to go and check it out. It was a brilliant interview with two-time guest Doomberg, who's seemingly agreed to come on for a third time. So we'll see how those predictions pan out here. It's probably not what maybe a bunch of our listeners want to hear, but I think it's an interesting conversation. It gives me, a little bit of optimism around the election stuff, regardless of the outcome, that hopefully either of the parties will take Canada's natural resource sector seriously. Again, this is hope, Keith, which is not necessarily a strategy, but
it could be a win-win either way. I mean, if people are, if they want the blue shirts to win because they want Canada to become an energy powerhouse, and if Doomberg is correct in saying that, hey, even if the red shirts win, it's going to happen anyway, then it maybe the outcome doesn't matter.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Next time I wanted to ask more questions, as you could tell. Next time we'll ask him about nuclear power. I think that's something, and his views on Germany and his views on the CANDU reactor in Canada and all the special technology.
Well, I think it'll be positive because the whole dispatchable power theme. I mean, that's the key one.
There
are some announcements, Rich, recently on small nuclear.
Yeah, Edmonton. So there's going to be outside Edmonton. There's going to be more and more nuclear power talk as we get into the summer. There's a little Easter egg for you. There's been a couple of announcements. One in Alberta. Remember over the summer there was all the tech people piling into it, Canadians need to
there might be a nuclear power announcement of the Loonie Hour as well. Maybe we'll see.
You guys are dropping all kinds of all
teasers. But one thing I'll leave you with this. One thing Canadians should be familiar with is how incredible the CANDU reactor is. It is just a marvelous technology that Canadians should be very, very proud of. And one of those good old fashioned government spending that actually worked it actually worked out. So there you go.
It won't do, or they can do. Yeah.
That's a
guys. Reminder.
Yeah.
Come hang out with us on Monday night. It's going to be a real good conversation about where the world is headed, and we'll get into it. But I think that's it for now, right, Steve?
I'm bringing a couple beers.
Yeah, me too.
Yes.
No, I'm just joking. But
Easter Monday.
I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a great conversation.
Yeah.
Easter Monday, NHL playoffs. What more can you ask? All right, guys. As always, appreciate the support. Hopefully you enjoyed that conversation. And we'll see you again next week with another good guest, another timely guest. So we'll see you next week. Thanks again for the support.